Look, just to begin, how musical was your household as a young lad growing up? Was there a lot of music in the house?
So my mother played the piano and my father played the guitar. And my mother was the more musical of the two, but also it's always worth saying my mom was born in 1944 and my dad was born in 39, and his own parents were born right at the close of the 19th century. And so both of them can remember when people would gather and play the piano and sing for their own entertainment. In my father's case, because they didn't even have a radio.
Were you enamored by the guitar right from the beginning, or was it a gradual build-up of interest for you?
No, it was right from the beginning. You know, I got a guitar when I was 7 years old. I begged them to get me sort of a department store guitar, and started taking lessons immediately. And I think I've been playing just about every day since then.
So was there ever another possible career path for you, or was it always going to be in music?
I think there could have been plenty of career paths. Like, as a musician, I tend to be, I've also written an illustrated book for children, and I've got a long association with the National Youth Science Camp. I've done about, for the past 12 years, I've done tours by bicycle to sort of try to drive home both an ecological and a philosophical and a humanistic point. So I think I could easily have been just a storyteller or a short story writer or a poet. Well, I don't know if I have what it takes to grind it out and truly become a poet. But I think I always would have been some kind of storyteller. That might be the best way to put it.
So in terms of songwriters, who were the first that really started to capture your imagination to the point that you wanted to try that field yourself?
So my mother was into classical music, but she also had Simon and Garfunkel's Bridge Over Troubled Water. And I became a fan of Paul Simon's writing kind of almost before I understood that songs are written by songwriters, if that makes sense. Like, I just thought, oh my God, I love this music, but there's something about this guy's sort of how articulate he is and how funny while being sad and mournful, or sort of jaunty while being neurotic, like there's something about that chemistry that just worked, and I'm still a fan. Like, I like his records now. So that was probably my window in, but honestly, the next songwriter that really became central to me was an American guy named Greg Brown.
Yep.
And he's become sort of a colleague and an acquaintance, I would say. I wouldn't call him a friend. And then, of course, Tom Waits was another. And then the rest of it was all my colleagues. Like, I have many colleagues. Chris Smither is fairly well known, as I understand it, down in Australia. Yes. And he's a dear friend. He's a dear friend, and he's my mentor, and he took me on the road everywhere. And there's a whole cadre of us that sort of came up opening shows for him specifically, like myself and Jeffrey Folcall and Chris Delmhorst and Mark Aureli. And, they're where I take a lot of inspiration. I know quite a few songs by my friends.
Like so many singer-songwriters, you did your fair share of busking in your early days. How do you look back on that experience now in terms of what did it teach you about communicating to an audience?
It taught me everything. It taught me literally everything. I had to, you either make your rent or you don't. I think that's about all you can say. You either reach people or you don't. And truthfully, the best part of it was that I was a subway busker. And so, I have probably a more empirical approach than a lot of people, a more intellectual approach than a lot of songwriters go by an instinctual approach, but I am a bit more empirical and intellectual. And when you're a subway musician, you get a blank, the train rolls away, and you have a blank, silent platform, and people wander up, and you have, 9 to 14 minutes to make an impression on them, and then they're gone. And so it's kind of like Groundhog Day, but it's Groundhog 11 minutes, like it's just this repeating thing. Here is a completely blank slate, a bunch of random strangers. Can you connect in a song or two?
Yeah. What do you recall now about your early songwriting attempts? Is it an art form that took a while to develop?
Oh, immensely. My first songs were Wandery and Juvenile, and I've read tons of poetry, and I've listened to thousands of songs, and you just, I guess I learned by comparison. More and more, I would find out what works, and there are all kinds of songwriters. I think of that guy, Bon Iver, Justin Vernon, that guy. His lyrics, if you actually sing them where you can make out what he's saying, they're dreadful, but when he sings them, they work. And part of it is that he sings them in such a mush-mouthed way that you're not meant to understand what the words are going by. They just work as sounds. And, this got proved. Peter Gabriel did that record where he covered people and they covered his songs. And he enunciated every word of Flume, that song by Bon Iver. And it's just dreadful. It just falls on its face. And I fall somewhere in the middle of all of this. Like, Randy Newman is such a great inspiration, and I don't pretend to be of his caliber, but I do love his economy. Like, somebody begins speaking, and you as the listener immediately begin drawing conclusions about who this person is by the language that they use, and you're not wrong. You're always right.
Do you ever reach a point in time where you've developed a tried and true method for songwriting, or is it something that always varies from song to song?
For me, there's no tried and true method, and I have all kinds of songs. I've set other poets' work to music. I've started with the music. I've started with the lyrics. I've been all over the map, but the one thing that I can say that is as close to a tried and true method as I've ever found is a deadline. And to that effect, I actually just started a songwriting group on my Patreon page, because we're all kind of stuck here in the pandemic in a total lockdown. And basically, just every Tuesday, everybody's got to turn in a song, and I'm the one that provides the prompt and, sort of steers the ship and does the monthly Zoom meeting to talk about it, or at least that's how I envision it. I literally just launched this weekend. But 90 people have signed up, and it's kind of like getting a gym membership. Honestly, it's aspirational. Like, I guess I better do this because I said I would do it,
Do you find teaching songwriting? I think you also teach guitar too, don't you?
I do. I mean, I teach it all of a piece. I've never actually taught discrete sit down and teach you how to play the guitar. I tend to work with usually more advanced students, but I teach it all of a piece because I am all of a piece. Like, I'm a singer and a songwriter and a guitar player, and I care about all the aspects of those things together.
Do you find sometimes you're teaching yourself things at the same time?
All the time.
Yeah.
Especially, I am a fairly unschooled music, and it's taken me quite a bit of time to learn music theory. That's something that I've picked up sort of on the back end. Like, I was writing many, many songs and working in alternate tunings and all that before I really began to even understand, 1, 4, 5, 6 minor, like the way those things fall together. And I learned them from educated musicians themselves rather than from teachers, because you have to have well, you don't. But if you have to have a language to speak to the musicians that you've hired to make your records sound good. Like, I may be paying them, but they know more about harmony than I do, and it would be insane of me not to learn their language, so that I could communicate with them in terms that they understand. So I guess that in that regard, I've always been a perpetual student.
What about the rate in which you complete songs? Is that something that comes in bursts, or is it usually a slow and steady process?
It used to come in bursts. And then I've noticed that if I just get myself in motion and get myself a weekly deadline where I'm writing all the time, it's not even so much that my weekly assignment becomes a good song. It's just that frees the engine up so that it's in motion, so that when I am actually inspired by something, that something tends to be better because I've got the gears humming.
Yeah. Your website describes you as an almost poet. For you, what leaves you short of being an actual poet?
Well, they have to get things to fly on their own. I feel like poetry and comedy and improvisational dance are probably the three highest art forms that I can think about. Mm-hmm. Like poetry, it's such a high bar. How can I just like one of the great American poets, Emily Dickinson, said, "When I feel as though the top of my head is being taken off, then I know that is poetry." Whereas songwriting is just honestly ought to feel good. I mean, it's certainly songwriters are certainly capable of greatness, but I guess I just rate poets as sort of a tier above us in the Tower of Art. See there, I just bent Leonard Cohen.
Is it a use it or lose it skill, songwriting? Can you find if you put yourself aside from songwriting for a while, it's hard to get back into it?
Absolutely. And it's a sort of a compounding doom, because if you go a long time without writing, your first several songs are going to be clunky and rusty, and so you dread doing it, and then you stay away from it. Absolutely.
You've worked with an array of producers over the years. Are you looking for a certain type in each project that you're working on, or do you look for someone who specifically fits that particular project that you're working with at hand?
It really is just to collide oneself off of a different sensibility. Like Chuck Prophet is, just a combative, pugnacious, sort of argumentative, wonderful. Like that's his approach. Like, no, why that? Why not something else? And then, Ani DeFranco is she's a born leader. She just listens really hard to everyone in her crew and then makes a decision. She's brilliant that way. And Todd Sickaphoos is a very heady and very, he's big ears. He's got big ears and sort of a big mind. Mm. And David Goodrich is just, David Goodrich is super loyal, and not necessarily to the artist that he's working with. He's very loyal to the song. He wants it to be better. So I've learned a ton from each one of them.
For someone who spends a great deal of time on the road, how have you coped with this past year or so, spending such an extensive period away from touring, having that enforced upon you?
In some ways, of course, it's been truly awful because it was a thing that gave me some meaning in life. I really, really lived for that, and it was a part of my identity. And obviously, especially in a place like America, where we have a truly wretched income inequality and a truly scandalously fragile social safety net, it's I feel somewhat guilty even thinking about it, because there are plenty of people who have been separated from food security or their leases, that they've been evicted, that they're, out of a job. And for my part, all I am doing is missing my calling. It's not lost on me that I was lucky enough to even find a calling. On the other hand, I was able to, through my live streams and through this Patreon, I was able to do something that's very important to me, which was every time I would do a live stream show, I would partner with one of these dear venues that I've loved so much. And the audience that I've built over the years would sort of tune in online, and I would split the money. I would portion it out between myself and the venue, and usually a nonprofit like a food bank or a homeless shelter or an advocacy group. And I was able to keep that sense of community alive. And I was able, frankly as well, and again, it's somewhat embarrassing to admit this, but I think I'm making a better living than I was before, because any first-year business student would look at the work I do and he, ask me what I do. I'd say, oh, well, I write songs and I deliver them to people. And he'd say, so it's intellectual property. Well, what's your business model? And I would say, well, I fly to Seattle and I rent a car and I go play for 90 people, and then I buy a $130 hotel room, and I do it the next night in Portland and the next night in Eugene. And he would look at me like I was dense, like I'm actually it's easier to make ends meet for me, which has been great because it means that I'm able to share that with the venues and with the nonprofits and with my agent and my manager and keep us all afloat till the world can resume again. And then on a personal note, as much as I loved the road, I've been on the road for 30 years, and I have never seen a neighborhood pass through a season. And now we got a dog like everybody else in America. We got a pandemic dog, and I'm walking 4 miles a day, a couple times a day through the neighborhood, and it's a nice little town. We got the occasional bear wanders through town, and everybody's walking their dog, and I'm watching it bloom and then grow up in the summer, and then watching the summer sort of tip over and fall down, and then the snow coming down, and that has been truly beautiful. And again, I don't know, as I understand it, things are way better in Australia, but here, our government, and to a certain extent, a good third of our citizenry we've all failed each other. And so it's just not safe to be indoors with your friends. So we have a couple of, metal fire pits, and I've got an axe and a chopping block and a half a quart of firewood. And that's the only way we can really visit now that the snow is down to stay. But in its own way, I wish we'd had the good common sense to visit like that when we didn't have to.
Yeah. Let's go back and talk about a couple of names that have already come up in our chat. Chris Smither is one. He is well known to us down here. I've spoken to Chris a couple of times myself. Tell us about your connection with Chris through the years.
When I was 22, so this would be like 30 years ago, I moved out to the Boston area, and he was, fairly big fish in that sort of folk pond. And I opened a show for him, and we just, we hit it off. He's a very forthright and open person, and I think, I think he'd tell you the same. A lot of that has to do with his nearly having died of his substance problems and his sense of having perhaps wasted, a decade or two. I think that gave him the sense of balance to be a very present, direct, forthright person. And so when Chris Smither likes you, he tells you that directly while looking you in the eye. And then, he invited me on the road, and I traveled, and, I was just a kid from the Midwest, and I traveled all through New England and Manhattan and California and the Pacific Northwest and Alaska and Ireland and France and England and the Netherlands. I've been everywhere with him. And I learned all the rules of the trade. I learned how to speak to a sound man, deferentially. Like, he goes about his business as though everyone. It's that old Alexander Pope thing: play well your part, there all honor lies. Like, he's the guy singing the songs, and that's great. But the audience is frankly more important than the guy singing the songs, and the sound man and the promoter and the volunteers at the folk club. None of this would happen without everyone doing it. And so there's a certain humility that I watched him evince, and then there's a certain nobility that comes out of that humility. And I don't know if I'll ever get there, but I suspect that imitating Chris and then getting old is probably at your best chance.
So it sounds like he really was a mentor in a true sense of the word.
Oh yeah. I mean, honestly, I would put him and then his manager, who is sort of the behind every great man, his manager and spouse, Carol Young, those two are probably my most solid mentors, both of them, the way that they have comported themselves ahead of my parents. Like my parents, I got real lucky with parents too. Like, my parents are both people that I look at and think you could definitely do worse than to model yourself on them.
Dave Goodrich is another. Tell us how you first came in contact with him and how the collaborative process worked between the two of you.
Oh, man. So for him, I was working, when I first got to Boston, I was working at a fairly legendary vintage guitar shop, and it was called the Music Emporium. And I was also, I knew Paul Simon, and that was about it, and he walked into the shop and asked if he could play like a 1920s National steel guitar. And he started playing Blind Willie Johnson, Dark Was the Night, Cold Was the Ground. And I just thought, what music is this? And I got to know him because he got a job at the shop too. And so he taught me quite a bit about music. And we became friends, and then we started writing together, and he was in a band which broke up, and then I took him on the road as sort of an accompanist. And so I think we wrote a good 3 or 4 records together, and played, I'm going to say we probably played 700 or 900 shows together over about 6 or 8 years. And so we just, we bonded in that way that you only can over time. And now we're both, we're both in semi-retirement. Like, he's a dad, and his wife is a tenured professor of poetry, and he still gets on the road maybe 20, 30 nights a year, or he did before the pandemic. But, I wonder, I feel like this pandemic is going to clear a lot of room. And I say that with all due respect, but I feel like I'm part of the brush that's going to get cleared out by the brush fire, if that makes sense. Like, I'm 51 years old, and I don't believe I'm going to go back and do 170 shows a year again, ever. Like, I've come to really like home a lot, and I think Goody maybe feels the same. And I think that when the pandemic is over, I might only do 90 or 100 shows a year. And in a way, I think that's going to be good for all the young men and women that are sort of champing at the bit to conquer this scene. I think this great interruption might actually be a good thing.
Yeah, a blessing in disguise.
Right.
Yeah. And one song of yours that generated a lot of attention in recent time, of course, was Take Down Your Flag, a song written in the wake of the horrible mass shooting at Charleston. Talk us through the writing of that song.
Yeah, I'm unlucky in that by accident, I was placed in an unusual American perspective. So my parents were Catholic volunteers down in what is now Belize, what at the time was British Honduras. And so they were sort of quietly, they were like hippies without the drugs, you know. They were like very straight-laced radicals. And so they've been dedicated to social justice all of their life, although they themselves are personally just very even-keeled and conservative people, if that makes sense. And so they, you know, the great American injustices, the three of them would be sort of our global sexism, which is, I think, true of most societies since agriculture, and then obviously our genocide of the native people here, and then the sort of othering and subjugation of African Americans. And so my parents raised me in the inner city of a Midwestern industrial city called Milwaukee, in a black neighborhood. So I was one of the few white people on my playground. And we weren't there because we were poor. You know, my father was a social worker and my mother worked part-time as the editor of a community newspaper. And so we genuinely had the means to live outside of a poor black neighborhood, and they decided that it would be good, and I think they were right, to raise us in that neighborhood. And so rather than all of this being theoretical to me, like I think to most white Americans, boy, you're going to get a long answer to this question, but
that's all right.
To most white Americans, the gulf between white people and black people is sort of a theoretical thing. To me, the gulf between white people and black people as a child was non-existent, because as a child, they're just, you know, it was just the playground, and these are just the kids on the playground. So I learned to be white probably as quickly as any black kid learns to be black, I saw the gulf grow up between me and my playmates, like firsthand, you know. And oh God. So anyway, I don't know. I know this formed me in any number of ways. Like, it was a rough neighborhood. It was a violent neighborhood. And that fell on me just like it fell on my playmates. But I had this get out of jail free card, which is I could just go join white America. Like, I could just leave if I want to. And so I've never wanted to entirely leave. Like, I have always looked at America and thought that our principal hypocrisy is that we're a supposed democracy, while if you're black in America, you don't live in a democracy, you live in an autocracy. You just, you know, you don't get to vote as easily as anybody else. Your vote doesn't count for as much. It is not as easy for you to buy a house. It's just not right. It's an autocracy for you, you know. So all of that leads to that moment when I'm on the road with Ani DeFranco and we're playing a show, you know, and most of us are white. Her drummer is the only black person in the room sometimes, you know. And so we're all hanging out and we're talking, and we play that night, and we go back to our hotel rooms, and, you know, the murders have happened in Charleston at the Emmanuel AME Church. And, you know, as it happens, a couple of black friends of mine called me and said, you know, Peter, this is not just some random thing. Like, that church is a significant church. You know, Dr. King spoke at that church. This is a guy attempting to light a fire. And, you know, so the next night we're all down in the dressing room, and I'm talking to Terrence Higgins, Ani's drummer, and I was talking to a friend of mine, Pamela Means, whom I grew up with in Milwaukee. She is a black woman. And we're all just sort of talking America, and we're talking over this, and then that detail that is just undeniably cruel, which is that in Columbia, South Carolina, the capital, at the State House, there are three flags: the American flag, the South Carolina flag, and the Confederate battle flag. And the American flag was at half-staff, and the South Carolina flag was at half-staff. But because of a whole legal squabble, they were not allowed, apparently, to take the Confederate battle flag down to half-staff. And so it's flying at the top of its flag, and all these funerals are going to be happening underneath it. One of the people killed was Clemente Pinckney, who was a state senator. And so on the grounds of the state Senate, there's a Confederate flag flying over his body as it's lying in state, and I couldn't stand it. And so I wrote that song over the next 15 minutes in my dressing room, and I went on stage, and it was half formed, and I was nervous because this is one of those taboo topics in America. But I figured, what the hell, Ani DeFranco's crowd is Ani DeFranco's crowd, and also, Ani has stuck her neck out so many times. So I sang it, and I managed to piss off the one Confederate flag sympathizer in that entire concert hall who came to my merch table and gave me an earful. But, since then, it became a thing, I went home and I recorded it. My friend Pamela Means, who I referred to before, she's a black Milwaukeean, in the way that I'm a white Milwaukeean. She recorded it on her iPhone, and we put it up on the internet, and then people started writing their own verses. Ani wrote her own verse, Pamela wrote her own verse, and a few hundred people wrote their own verse. And I don't know how to not be divisive, because I have to tell you, I lost dozens of fans, and that really saddens me, because I don't understand. I'm not telling you you're a bad person. I'm telling you this is a cruel symbol. And yes, I can't see any other way to do it. That might be the best way to put it. Some people wrote me fairly harsh, sort of fuck off kind of emails. And I didn't really have much of a response. But occasionally people would say, look, my great-great-grandfather fought in the Confederacy, and I would try. I would do my very best and say, look, I understand that means something to you, but the symbol is a symbol of cruelty, and I couldn't reach them. Then I would get a fuck you. So what are you going to do?
Yeah. I'm interested to talk about your bike tours, touring from gig to gig via bike. Tell us, firstly, how your love for riding came about, and the logistics of a tour like that.
I guess I always liked to ride my bike. It's a thing that I always liked as a child. And then as an adult, in fact, I can tie this back to Chris Smither. When I was in my late 20s, I first went on the road. I was still eating like I was a teenager, and I was not exercising at all. And I fell into this funk and this depression, and I put on about 20 pounds. And I remember when Chris Smither got on the tour bus. I was on a tour bus opening for Dar Williams, and Smither happened to be in town. He gets on the tour bus, and he takes one look at me, and it's like, Mulvey, listen, you got to start taking care of yourself. This is just how it's got to be. Listen, all right? Me at my age, I'm just keeping pace with the deterioration of my own frame. But you're going to feel like someone dropped a whole new engine under the hood. And he gave me the hard sell. And so I did. I started going on long distance bike rides. And then I guess one day I was just foolish enough to realize that if there was a venue that was about 95 kilometers from my house. And I thought, well, if I could hook my guitar up to a trailer, I could go play that venue. And then there was another venue, just another 70 kilometers beyond that. And I thought, wait a minute, I could put a little tour together. And that was it. The first one was terrible. I packed way too much stuff. I got rained on. I got sunburnt. And I've done it every year since then. It's fun, and it's a chance to step off the 20th century sort of gerbil wheel. You ever see the movie Up in the Air with George Clooney?
Yes, yeah.
That's the life of a touring folk singer. I love the music and I love the club, but honest to God, so much of my life is just an airplane, a rental car, and a mid-grade hotel. So it's a chance to, be outside.
Whereabouts would be your best markets or the most areas of interest outside the United States for you?
It is places that have most resisted the sort of blandification and strip mallification, the gapification and Starbuckification of the universe. So I do really well in Alaska, and I do really well in Manhattan, which is one of the most neighborhoody cities in America. I do really well in Boston because it's so, I think because it's so academic and scientific. I do really well in Vermont because there's just so many sort of outdoorsy people. I do really well in Colorado. Like any place. I do very poorly in. How would I describe this? Like I do very poorly in bland cities, and I do very well in Dublin, Ireland. I haven't been to Australia, so you tell me. Like, what is my understanding of Australia is limited, but it seems to me that Australia is quite a bit more outdoorsy. Like it's sort of it's sort of like a very, very arid Colorado/Hawaii. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, you do very well down here. We have a wonderful festival season in the first quarter of every year. You probably wouldn't be able to bring your bike because our cities are well distanced, but
right.
No, you'd certainly be a market here for you for sure.
Oh, good. Well, that's good to know. Man, I got to get down there one of these days.
And just before I let you go, Peter, I believe there's a new album in the works. Is that right? I did hear something along those lines.
Well, there's a record that just came out in October, and it's called Peter Mulvey with Sister Strings, live at the Cafe Carp. So it's a tiny little folk club in a little town west of Milwaukee where I grew up. And we made 2 records in one weekend. I've been working with this. They are a band all on their own. They're called Sister Strings. They are Shanti Ross and Monique Ross, these 2 young women who play cello and violin and sing. And they are spectacularly well-educated classical musicians, but they also play soul and hip-hop and sort of, they're tremendous improvisers, and they are, in fact, sisters. And so we've formed like a little band. There's a 4th member who plays like a tiny little drum kit, and so that's the entire lineup. And we descended on sort of my spiritual stomping grounds, the Cafe Carp, it's called. And we made a studio record during the day, and then we made a live record on 2 successive nights. And so we made 2 records on the last weekend of January 2020, and we were planning to release them within about 6 months of each other and do this epic tour to release them both. And now that is never going to happen. But we still did. We released the live one, and now we're going to release the studio one, I would imagine, sometime in the Northern Hemisphere summer, this June or July.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah, and that one I think is going to be called Shenandoah. And it's... I've been trying to write about that record is sort of focused on the autocracy that is threatening the democracy here in the United States. Like that as soon as all this went down, I was surprised, but it was not lost on me that anybody who studied mid-century Europe was completely unsurprised. You have essentially economic inequality and then someone that you can tag as a threatening other. And then you have demagoguery, and those ingredients always come together. And my concern is that, of course, we all need to live our lives, and we need to love our kids, and we need to, make our art. And yet somehow it is also on us to resist autocracy and defend our democracy. And I've always marveled at how unprepared we all feel for that. Like, we all feel like Sam and Frodo, you know, like, seriously, like, we're the ones that are supposed to fix this shit. And yet, of course, I feel like it's our ordinary decency that needs to be juxtaposed up against the internment camps. I can't believe I am saying this, but we have American internment camps, and, you know, and the sort of power seizure by a third of your electorate. Like, apparently we're going to have to win this by what? I guess by decency and by showing up, which, you know, for me this summer was immensely encouraging, was how many of the people who were standing up against autocracy as it spread from only Black Americans to, I shouldn't say only, it used to be only Black Americans and poor Americans, but now they seem to want to export autocracy all the way through about 2/3 of the populace. And it was immensely encouraging to me to see all the white people in the streets defending George Floyd, you know, or the next George Floyd. That, to me, that is what I hope my next record is about. And I mostly because I, unlike a lot of people, I happened to be positioned closer to the rail to hear the train coming, you know.
Hey, Peter, great to speak with you today. And thanks for being so generous with your time. Congratulations on some wonderful songs so far, and no doubt there's plenty more to come. And we hope that once the world is back to some sort of normality, we do get to see you down here. That'll be great.
Absolutely, thank you. And how are things? Are you guys safe?
Pretty good, yeah.
I know. Yeah.
It's been pretty good. We've had to endure some pretty harsh lockdowns and compulsory mask wearing, but we went here in my state, here in Victoria, we went for 62 days without a single case coming through. There's a little cluster or two still popping up here or there, but it's well under control. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a part of me that thinks Jacinda Ardern should be made the Empress of the planet Earth. You know, like.
Oh, she did a fantastic job over there. Yeah.
Right, or the president of Vietnam. Vietnam has done well, but all right. Well, I'm glad to hear that you are safe, and thank you. Let me know when this comes out.
Most certainly will. All the best to you.
All right.
Thanks, Peter.
Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Bye.